Welcome to the first presentation of our 2020-21 speaker series. Our speakers are offered the last Wednesday of each month from September to May, except December for Christmas, and March when it's our annual meeting. The current conditions of the pandemic force us to move away from in-person presentations at the museum to an online format via Facebook. The video presentation will be posted the following day to the Brant Historical Society website. You can submit questions to information@brantmuseums.ca. That's information spelled out in full, and Brant Museums, more than one, at .ca. A selection of submitted questions and their answers will be posted to the website when available. Please visit our Facebook page to see all of the videos that were produced from May to September. A few of the most popular are the natural dyes, preserves and canning, and the virtual tour of Myrtleville House. Visit the Society website to learn about the date and time of various walking tours, guest speakers, and other presentations. On Wednesday, October the 28th at 7 p.m., local historian Jean Farquharson will present on the topic Gypsum, the rock nobody knows, mines and mills along the Grand. We acknowledge that this event is taking place upon the traditional territories. The territories of the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Confederacy, the Anishinaabe peoples of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations, and before them the Chinanton Nation called the Neutral by the French, and the Attawandaron by the surrounding nations. These peoples are the original caretakers, the peoples who lived and ultimately worked with these lands. We acknowledge that we have a responsibility to know and understand their heritage. The treaty that was signed for this territory is the Between the Lakes Treaty, number 3 of 1792, and further the deed referred to as the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784, which applies to land 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, from the mouth to its source. We need to be aware of our role in these documents. We also acknowledge the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples upon this land. We acknowledge that we have an obligation to learn to live wisely together on this land.
Okay.
Oh, didn't see you there. Hi, I'm Tyler Britz, and in today's first 2020-2021 Brant Historical Society speaker series, we are going to be talking about buildings we have lost here in Brantford. Before we get started, just a little disclaimer. Brantford looks a lot different today than it did even 10 years ago, and just taking a walk downtown, you can see all the construction everywhere, buildings being demolished and new ones putting up in their place. And so many buildings are now lost to the sands of time or at the hands of developers, and all you have to do is ask anybody who's on the Heritage Committee and they'll tell you all about that. Obviously, not every aesthetically pleasing building from Brantford's history will be included in this presentation. There's just too many. There's a lot of buildings in this town that were beautiful, a lot of like John Turner architecture, a lot of fancy stuff that just doesn't exist anymore. But this would be a lot longer presentation if I tried to include all of them. So the ones that will be shown here were chosen because of the photography, because this is photos of the buildings we've lost, or their relevance to history. So we'll jump right in, starting with Excels. So the Excels building is actually way at the back of the photo here. It's at the head of the street, and it is about where the Boer Memorial Monument and the armories would be today. It was a saloon and a general store, and it had a famous sign that, above the door that said, "The sign is high and hinders none. Refresh and pay and travel on." So it was right at the mouth of the bridge, and people say that it was one of the first established businesses, large buildings to go up in Brantford, and it was just kind of a local institution for as long as it was there. So I decided to start with this one because it's kind of, for as long as it was there, it was kind of the start of Brantford and like the center of Brantford. So it's an important historical building. And just some more about Excels. I say it was a saloon and a general store, and when I say it was a general store, just a few things listed. You could buy an umbrella, a gun, and anything to do with fishing in the same place as you get your locks fixed. So if only places like that existed today. We have City Hall, well, old City Hall. I guess old City Hall at this point. So it was built originally in 1849, and it stood in the square until 1965, so 116 years, and then it was torn down. It was surrounded by the market, so as a lot of towns did, the market would just kind of pop up around the City Hall, hence Market Street. Ever hear of it? And this building, at least within the Brant Historical Society, is kind of iconic to Brantford's history. So we'll look at some images here. So this is the first one. You can see we have J. Manfredi Fruits just kind of hawking pineapples directly in front of City Hall. It was the face of the city for 116 years. An interesting thing is you can kind of see them in this image are the lampposts, of which the Brant Museum and Archives has one on its second floor. This is another wide shot. You can see the market fully bustling kind of around City Hall. This is also from the side compared to this image here. You can see next to it there's a stall attached to the back for market. There's like a little carriage in there, and you can. But this is clearly taken. This picture was clearly taken on an off day because there's no people surrounding the building. Also, you can see some church spiders in the back, and those are going to come up later. So remember those. This is an aerial shot, and you can see this is a bit later because well, there's cars instead of buggies like the last one. And City Hall's down in front. And that's also just in general a beautiful shot of Brantford's downtown. You can get Victoria Square and all the old buildings. A lot of those aren't there anymore. They'll come up later. So this is kind of how City Hall met its end. You can see they demolished it in order to put up the Market Square Mall. And well, we kind of all know how that turned out, you know. I don't have to tell the whole story about the economic downturn and how the mall isn't really a mall anymore. But, you know, the legacy of Brantford City Hall kind of still lives on because it's a beautiful building and it's something that's fondly remembered in Brantford. Next, we have the Fire Hall. So you can see that it stood just across the street from the Federal Building, which is still there, obviously. And they kind of have a whole like two towers thing. So there's the two towers in the center of the town. So here we see in this other picture of the fire hall, you can kind of see all the kind of historical firemen lined up in front with their horse and buggy fire. I guess it wouldn't really be a fire engine, but the equivalent at the time. So the one kind of iconic thing that would be in most fire halls would be the bell, and this is the removal of the bell in 1949. And I love this picture. This is probably one of my favorite pictures in the whole set, solely because you can see how far construction regulations have come, because that bell is held on by like 3 wires, and if I saw that, I don't know if I'd be anywhere near that happening nowadays. Once the bell was removed from the fire hall, its final resting place was in front of the Brant Museum Archives, where it still sits today. Very large, very imposing. Love to hear it rain. I don't think that can be arranged though, it's kind of heavy. This is a picture from the interior of the fire hall, so you can kind of see like the bays for the carriages and the horse rigs. And if I talked about the picture of the bell coming up the top, being one of my favorite pictures in this set, this is probably one of my least favorite, because I just kind of get a weird vibe from these horse rigs hanging from the ceiling. Next up, we have some photos of the municipal rail line. So this is the, or as the picture reads, the Brantford Street R barn, built in 1886, torn down in 1937. So this is one of the barn. There was a second one across the bridge. Both of them housed you guessed it, the cars for the rail line, which is something a lot of people, if you weren't really engrossed in Brantford history, would kind of forget that Brantford had, was a streetcar system. And that's a lot of towns Brantford size back in the 1800s had, or late 1800s, early 1900s, had rail lines. So these buildings are, I'll be the first to admit, these buildings are less on the more beautiful side and more on the more historically significant side. This is a nice picture here, you can see, so it says right on the photo, car shops, Brantford Municipal Railway, and there's two different rail cars waiting to go out. But yeah, it was a really important part of Brantford's history and just people getting around. Next we have Victoria Hall, which you could say compared to the rail car stations are, maybe it's looking a bit better. So originally it was First Presbyterian Church, and it is currently where the court and city hall are now, so just across the street from the Brant Museum and Archives. So it was a church from when it was built in 1845, and then it was then turned into Victoria Hall in 1878. So this is it after it was First Presbyterian. Just really, really nice architecture, standard of the times. So you have this kind of tower up front, lots of balconies, lots of windows. And in 1901, it was turned into the YWCA Association building. So we can keep going. So this is just a lot of pictures of it, and there's a lot of pictures of it in the collection, and a lot of them emphasize its balconies because that was kind of a unique feature it had compared to a lot of the other buildings in Brantford at the time. So there's one. That's another postcard of it, so just kind of backed up a bit. Just a nice building. This one's in color compared to, well that one. So eventually this building was demoed in the 1950s, and then fast forward a few years, in the 80s they put up the Brantford City Hall and the court that's there. So next we have Wycliffe Hall, which was kind of across downtown and was the YMCA building, not the YWCA building. This picture here is from when the Earl of Bessborough came through town. So kind of an important British guy, government guy came through, and people kind of lined the streets for him, and he gave a speech, and it's in the background there. This is an unrelated building in the foreground, but that's there. It's City Hall. This is the building here in the back. So that is when it was the YMCA. That's a few years later. So it had shops all along the bottom, and the second floor was a music hall that could fit 800 people. And that's, if we're talking about construction and building safety codes, I don't think you could get away for a hall that fits 800 on a second floor of building. So so it's not in this picture, but it is in this one. One of the bottom floor was eventually converted into the Hollywood Cafe, which was a kind of a known cafe in Brantford. There's also I love this picture because you got the little car in front, and at the top there's an advertisement just for dancing. This is a recreation of it. There's a few pencil drawings like this later on as well. So it says Young Men's Christians Association Building, Brantford, Ontario. Next we have the Spencer Brewery, which was located in West Brant, so just over the bridge, down Colburn a little bit more. Eventually, their Spencer Brewery was. It was on Strawberry Hill, which that's just a picturesque name. You look at this photo, it's just nestled on the hill. There's a forest behind it. So if we keep going, it's very picturesque, beautiful place. Here's some employees. They don't look too happy. I can't imagine labor conditions at a brewery in the early 1900s were that great. Less picturesque, I set up the picturesque for this, knocking it down, it burned down. And there's pictures of it burning down, and there's spoilers for later in the presentation. A lot of buildings in this town have burned down, but Spencer Brewery is the first one that we have pictures of, and I'm showing you pictures of. So here is, a bunch of guys trying to haul a hose up to put out the fires. Maybe they're just a little late because if you look on the far right of the picture, that side's pretty much already completely burned down. So, and this is a picture taken after the fact, so obviously they failed to put out the fire, the brewery burned down, and this is a picture of the ruins. Next we have the Bixel Brewery, which, if you can tell from this photo, it's pretty difficult, is kind of where Shallow Creek Park is nowadays. So just behind Clarence. So Bixel Brewery was another large brewery in the town, kind of made all sorts of drinks. So you can see right in front of this picture is taken from the far side of the canal, and they have giant signs posted along the street that say ale, lagers, and lagers, and Bixels from 1859. So this is an unrelated picture of when Eagle Place flooded in the early 1900s. Well, it kind of still does flood, but the floods used to be way worse, as you can see. But if you look really closely in the background of this photo, you can see the Bixel Brewery, and it is, because of the placement of the canal and such, it is not underwater. I don't know how the bottom floors are, but you can see it's not as bad as these houses in the foreground are, at least. This is a picture from a business map from the late 1800s, early 1900s that kind of outlined kind of what Brantford had to offer to potential investors. And this is kind of Bixel's sections on there. So the Bixel Brewing and Malting Co., Brewers and Maltsters. And that's kind of an artist's rendition of what we just saw. Next we have the Belmont Hotel. So the Belmont Hotel sat at the top of Colburn, kind of near where the library is today. And this is one of these buildings where you look at it and it's like you could hope that still exists, you know, like that looks like it could still fit on a Brantford street today. Also, it has this really fun lettering, like you see along the street and on the front. I don't know, interesting building. And if we keep going, the Belmont Hotel also has a less than pretty ending, where it burned down. So this is a picture from, I think it's 1972, around there. The Belmont burned down, and you can see everybody's favorite Zellers, not there anymore. Neither is the Belmont, because it burned all the way down. They couldn't save it. So next we have the Bodega Hotel, which is another sizable hotel from Brantford's history, and it's sat on the corner of Market and Darling Street, where the TD Bank is now. So it was a very popular hotel in town for people coming in and out of town, and it was known for its tavern, so a lot of people would come in, have a drink, sit in the hotel bar, as you do. So of course we're focusing on the buildings, but the context of the photos are important. So in the foreground of this picture, you can see soldiers leaving for World War I, and they're walking down Market Street towards the train station. So they could, you know, take a train to somewhere, get overseas. You guys know the rest of the story, hopefully. So this is another picture kind of similar to the bell from the fire station earlier. Love this photo just because, you know, just some guys on a ladder and they're pulling a safe through a window. And like this looks like the setup to some sort of Looney Tunes cartoon. But it's not, it's a piece of Brantford's history. So that's it. When there isn't soldiers in the street, you can see it a bit more. It's a pretty big hotel for the time. We'll get to the really big one in a few more photo sets, but the Bodega Inn was a pretty big deal. This is a picture from the side of it where that's where you go into the bar, and these buildings down the street, also kind of row housing looking, are the Foresters League, which was kind of a big institution around the same time. Next we have the House of Refuge. So for those of you who don't know what a House of Refuge is, so it's kind of like a hospice or a place for the infirm or old, and it was all done through charitable donations. So this is the original building, which was, it was on a hill up in West Brant, on Bell Lane. So this was the original building, so beautiful, it's like architecture standard of the time, kind of looks like BCI or like a central school. Very like towers, circular windows. Eventually there was an expansion. So the expansion, they just kind of mirrored the first half. So it's almost the exact same. There's a few differences if you want to like search and find with this photo. There's, you know, the chimneys are slightly different, but besides that, you know, it was kind of a mirror. So the Kiwanis Club also operated out of the House of Refuge, and they're just kind of like, you know, a general charity organization, and kind of similar to past photos that, a few past photos I've shown, you kind of want to see who's in the building, like what the building represents. So we have the Kiwanis Club here, and they're on the back corner, just behind it, atop the hill, and just fun detail, if you look up in the corner, there's a clown and a police officer. And I don't know the context of either of them to be there, but you know, children's charity, maybe that's why the clown's there. Next we have the Brantford Sanatorium, and pictured here, it's kind of picturesque. It's removed from the main downtown core of the city, well, because it was originally meant to be a tuberculosis quarantine like hospital. So you had TB and they sent you here. So this is the gateway for it, and there's actually one of the famous Brantford postcard that's a very similar picture to this. And this is just beautiful with the arch with the crosses, and you can kind of see the driveway pathway going up, and the building would have been at the top, kind of behind the trees there. And parts of the sanatorium, oh, here's the postcard. Parts of the sanatorium are still there to this day. There's a lot more modern buildings that have replaced it, but bits and pieces of the building, is a lawn building, so bits and pieces of it are still there. So these are some female patients. So this is after, when it was eventually, so when tuberculosis kind of downgraded as a threat, it was eventually, the sanatorium was just used as a general sanatorium, so people just that were any sort of special needs, differently abled, so be it mental or physical, were sent to the sanatorium. This is the rooftop, so these kids would have been at risk for TB or showing signs of it, and they believed that getting in the fresh air would have been helpful, so they're in like rolly beds on the rooftop of the sanatorium. Which, I'll continue the theme of safety standards, I don't know how that would be viewed nowadays. So the next one, of course, this has quarantine, kind of has a different meaning in 2020. Well, the same meaning, but a bit more powerful meaning than perhaps when I made this slide originally. But this is a bunch of, this would have been the boys' tuberculosis ward. Next, kind of keeping with the medical theme of the sanatorium, we have the Stratfor Hospital. And personally, this is one of my favorite photos. I think the composition here, this is a really beautiful photo, just kind of the hospital isolated on the hill. So the Stratfor Hospital, it's a John Turner, so the architecture is really fancy and nice, and you know, it's got all the hallmarks, you know, the round and the chimneys and the spires. A lot more people can talk better about John Turner architecture than I can. This is not the talk for that. So the Stratfor Hospital was made on donated land and with donated money from John H. Stratford. And he donated the money on one condition, as long as there would be a board to run the hospital that included the mayor. And to this day, 2020, that is still a thing. So in 1885, plans were drawn up for the hospital, and it opened, grand opening was in 1888. So the Stratfor Hospital has been operating since 1888, and it's no longer called the Stratfor Hospital. We would know it as Brant General, but it is still serves the same community. It's in the same spot. This is kind of similar to this last picture. It's very, like, I use the term looming. It kind of is huge, scary. I would not want to walk into this hospital unless I really needed to. Also, it's 1888, so I don't really know if I would have trusted going into a hospital around this time either. So eventually it was torn down, or most of it was torn down, and they put up Brant General in its place. But it was Brantford's first major hospital. So this was drawn in 1885, and so this was it's kind of similar to the drawings I showed you before. It's a pencil drawing, but this would have been before the building was up. So it's stamped 1885. So this was a drawing of like what I assume would be a drawing of what the building would look like. Next up is the Kirby Hotel, which is another Brantford Historical Society kind of favorite. People like the Kirby Hotel just because it was kind of similar to the Bodega Hotel. It was kind of like a Brantford institution when it was up. Like, it was a big deal. The Kirby Hotel for a long time was the largest hotel in Canada West, and it could serve 500 guests at a time, and it held that title until the Royal York opened in Toronto, which is pretty impressive. The Kirby Hotel had a lot of uses. So it was just a gathering place, bar, tap room, etc. But also for a short time after it opened in 1854, it was a barracks for British soldiers who were coming through. This would be a postcard, so and if you read the bottom, it says Hotel Kirby, Brantford, Ontario, Canada, and that's it was located where there now is a giant parking lot behind the mall on the corner of like Charlotte, Dalhousie, and Colburn. So like that kind of run there. This is a photo of it in the 1960s, which kind of a winter photo, with slush on the ground, and you can see just all the signs up the street for Kirby Hotel. This is a photo of the dining hall. So the dining hall was one of the more famous things about the Kirby Hotel, because a lot of famous people stayed in the Kirby Hotel over the time it was open. So John MacDonald stayed there for a short time. The Prince of Wales stayed there when he came through town, and after the Bell Memorial was opened, Alexander Graham Bell stayed there, and they had a large banquet dinner for him in this room, and he gave a speech. So it's kind of remembered as that kind of, if you were somebody, that's where you stayed when you came to Brantford. This is the bed that the Prince of Wales stayed in. I think it's, personally a little weird taking a picture. This is the guy's bed. I don't know. That's me. I don't know. If you're into royals and such like that, that's, maybe interesting for you. This is a photo of all the staff kind of lined up in the dining room, and you can see in the background of this picture, it's from a different angle because the Christmas tree is behind them. That's a picture from, this would have been down Charlotte Street looking sideways. So Hotel Kirby, Kirby Hotel, there's advertisements all over it. There's a lot of shops along the bottom row. They were all connected. This would have been the barber shop. This guy is not too happy about having this photo taken. This is the tap room in the Kirby Hotel. Unlike the guy in the last photo, this guy's very happy to be having his photo taken. Kind of the bar room, obviously unoccupied. And who may have foreshadowed this earlier, the Kirby Hotel also burned down. So this is just an excellent picture of the Kirby Hotel. Some of the best pictures in this whole slide are going to come from the Kirby Hotel. We're going to get to them in a second. This is just a picture, smoke pouring out the windows, firemen trying to put it out. You can see on the front, we have the Hotel Kirby, ladies and escorts. So read into that what you will. So this is, there's a lot of pictures in the historical archive collection of the hotel. Somebody clearly went in and took a lot of pictures after it burned down, the year it burned down. So this is the hallway. You can't really see any evidence of fire in this picture except for this large hole in the wall over here. I don't know what that would have caused. What caused that? This picture is, I've talked a lot about this picture to my friends down here at the Brantford Historical Society, and just how this looks like a still from a horror movie, or I don't know, but this is probably the artsiest photo in all of the photos I'm showing you here. Just, the light pouring down the stairwell, the wall that's clearly like water and or fire damaged, maybe both, piles of trash in the foreground. This is a beautiful one, folks. this is the same bar room from before, well, the pictures from before were way earlier because in this one you can tell there's fun leather chairs instead of weird wooden stools everywhere. But once again, this is post-fire. And this is the other end of the hotel from the picture from before, and this is when it was all burned out. And as I said before, the Kirby Hotel was demolished after it burned down, and there's nothing in its place. They put up the mall, and it's just a parking lot now. So next we have the Congregational Church, which is now called Central Presbyterian. It also doesn't look like this anymore. And you may wonder why. You say, Tyler, that's such a beautiful building with such a large spire. What could have happened to it? Well, it got struck by lightning. And so this is the building that is next to the Carnegie Library across from Victoria Park. And it was constructed in 1865, and then it was constructed with this design. And eventually, the top of the spire was struck by lightning, and it fell into the church, and they had to rebuild pretty much the whole church because that's a giant spire to fall through the roof. This is another great picture. So you can see, this is from the center of Victoria Park, and you can see there's a cannon in the foreground. That's the cannon that's now in Alexandria Park, kind of on the other end of downtown. But yeah. So next we have the Wellington Methodist / United Church, which was a church that's located kind of near the bus terminal, so like kind of in the middle of that giant parking lot in between like where the bus terminal is and where like across from the courthouse. Kind of a unique church building for Brantford. So you'll notice, this was pointed out to me, that there's no spire on it. So it's kind of unusual for most of the churches in Brantford, at least the ones that we've talked about, and a lot of the older ones have large tower spires. This one, more rounded, no spire on it, except for these two kind of fun pillars in front. So it was constructed in 1854, and it was the Methodist Church until 1925 when it was switched to United, and it was Wellington United. It also underwent renovations in 1874 where they added this front part. So originally it was just flat, and they kind of added jutted out another room on the front of it, and they changed a bunch of the stuff inside it. But nowadays it's no longer there, and it is a bus terminal parking lot. So moving on, we have the Grand Opera. So this was on the northeast corner of West Street and Darling Street. And it was an opera house, and like a lot of the opera houses in Brantford, it was a very big deal when it existed. There were shops all down the side of it. It seated a lot of people, and it was one of the three opera houses, one of like the big three opera houses in Brantford. And the Grand Opera was known for the fact that it had not one but two balconies. Kind of has a tragic story. So the plot of land that it was on West and Darling was bought, and they bought out the businesses that were there, and they bought the Grand Opera, and then they demolished it, and it was part of their plan to beautify downtown. But then the Great Depression hit, and the city ran out of money, and the lot sat vacant for a lot of years, and now there's housing there. But also, it took a lot of work to find this photo, because despite the fact that there was three opera houses in Brantford, there's not a lot of research done into them, not a lot of talk about them compared to some of the other buildings like the Kirby Hotel or stuff like that, most of the churches. So the Baronial Hall is one of the oldest kind of beautiful buildings we talk about. The Baronial Hall went up in the early 1800s, and well, this picture was, it's dated 1840, but I don't know if it actually was from 1840. And it was known for its driveway. It had a large circular driveway, and it was once called, in like an official statement about Brantford, as the handsomest house in the village. It was owned by a John A. Wilkes, You'll notice on this picture it says G.S. Wilkes. The problem with that is that this is one of the only photos of it, and in the Brant Historical Society we had a odyssey attempting to find more information about this. We had to look at fire insurance maps and old other like business maps and things like that to try to map out where this was and get any sort of information if it was G.S. or John A. Wilkes who owned this property. And then similar to the Kirby Hotel, it was used as a hospital for Imperial soldiers. So not a barracks, it was a hospital. And that was either in 1876 or 1867 or 1868. Because you can see on this picture it's been crossed out in ink. So I tried, when putting this presentation together and kind of compiling all these photos, I tried to find some that people within the Brant Historical Society or just in general the public would have heard about before. So this is a picture of Scrivener's Boathouse, and this picture's taken from the far side of the canal, looking up at downtown. You can see that's Town Hall, Old Town Hall. And it was owned by one Mr. Scrivener, and it was just sort of a warehouse that boats would land and unload their goods, usually coming from Buffalo, and then things would be loaded in to send back to Buffalo. And you can't see it in this photo, but the description written on this photo is that Scrivener's Boathouse was basically underneath the Market Street Bridge. And the story of Mr. Scrivener is kind of interesting because he died at a very young age, 27, and he drowned in the Drumbo Swamp. And it was, at the time, it was the most attended funeral in Brantford's history. He was a well-known man for owning this kind of ramshackle boathouse down the canal. Almost last, we have the Young Ladies College in Brantford. This is a drawing of an old woodcut of this building. This is a beautiful building, small spire, left, right wings on it, and this is where BCI is nowadays. And there's just a wood cutting of it, and we have a very dark photo of it. But just kind of a disclaimer as we talk about these two schools is if you've noticed a lot of these buildings, I only have two schools, I have no industry buildings. That's because a lot of those two topics have kind of been done over and over again within the Brant Historical Society. They're out there if you want to learn about them. There's a lot of information about those out there. So I kind of avoided those two topics in favor of more or lesser known buildings that we've lost. So last but not least is 103 Darling, this is not really a well-known or standout building like some of the hotels, churches, etc., town hall that we talked about, but it's important nonetheless, and I can use this kind of as a platform diving board to kind of talk about the concept of heritage within Brantford. So 103 Darling was a residence, just like a house, but it was a John Turner. So John Turner, big name architect from Brantford, designed a lot of nice buildings here and all over southern Ontario, and this was a building designed by him, and it is a pretty nice looking building. It's plain, but it's not necessarily unattractive to the eye. You can see it here on the corner of Darling, or George and Darling. But this is a building we have lost. It is no longer there, and it was replaced by the Wilfrid Laurier Brantford Students Center, or Students Union Center. And it kind of represents what has happened to so many buildings in Brantford, and it's that fire has stopped being the biggest threat. So throughout here we've seen so many buildings that burn down, and nowadays it's not people worrying about if old buildings will burn down, it's whether or not some real estate company or some university is going to come in, buy them and tear them down. And you can argue about the ethics of that and preserving. A lot of people around the Brant Historical Society are on the Heritage Committee and will fight you tooth and nail on things like that. But the Heritage Committee, there's undeniable that there's people there that are fighting to save buildings like this because they represent so much of our history. And And you can see that's kind of why I've tried to put things like Scribner's Boathouse and pictures like the Kiwanis Club in, just to see that it's not just pictures of buildings, they were part of people's lives, and regardless of if they were beautiful or ugly, they were part of Brantford, and it's a part of Brantford's history. And despite the fact that the new Wilfrid Laurier building that is in this place tried its hardest to look the same as the style of all the other buildings around Victoria Square, you can tell just by looking at it that it is new and that they tried, but it is not the same, because you can't put the genie back in the bottle. It's historical buildings are historical for a reason. Thanks for listening.